Okay, so this project was originally presented at the World Infant Mental Health Conference back in July of 2023. This project is looking at the advice that parents get in sleep books and whether or not that advice is well supported by research and if it really maps to parental real-world experiences with sleep training. Basically, I took the top 10, really top 8 best-selling sleep books based on an Amazon.com search, and I added 2 pretty well-known and highly used online internet programs, Taking Care of Babies, and one called Moms on Call. Moms on Call also has sort of a book, but it's accompanying their online program. Taking Care of Babies, as far as I know, is a purely online program. So I looked at the top 8 books plus these other 2, and I gathered information about what age they recommended starting sleep training, the reasons that parents should initiate sleep training, what they should do, how much parental response to allow, and then information they gave parents about the speed, effectiveness of the intervention, and whether there were any potential negative side effects. So these are the books and programs that were included. So when I looked at the advice, what I found is that there were certain overarching themes. Sleep problems are common, potentially dangerous, and persist in the long term. Parental behavior is the primary driver of sleep problems. The books say starting earlier is easy and prevents sleep problems from ever occurring. And that extinction, or popularly crying it out, is the most effective approach. It's quick, easy, and has no negative side effects. Now, just a side note, while books say that sleep problems are common, actually the research shows that it only occurs in about 20 to 30% of infants. And in terms of the persistence of sleep problems, persistence only occurs in between 1 and 6% of that 20 and 30%. So that translates into a total of about 1 to 6% of infants will ever have a persistent sleep problem. Nevertheless, sleep books encourage 100% of parents to prevent sleep problems from occurring. And here is a summary about what advice suggests. I'll move myself around. First of all, on the left here in this slide are the types of categories of extinction that are recommended in books. The first in research is pure or unmodified extinction. Popularly, this is called cold turkey, or some people refer to crying it out as pure extinction. This is where you put the child in the bed, you leave the room, you don't go back till morning. The second version is called graduated extinction. This can also be called in research modified extinction, controlled crying, planned ignoring, minimal check. There's a lot of different terms. There's decremental extinction. There's a lot of different types. But basically this allows the parent at some point or at varying points to go back in and check in on the baby, not picking the baby up, but checking in periodically. Popularly, this is called Ferberizing after Richard Ferber, also called crying it out, time checks. Taking Care of Babies calls it pop-ins. There's a lot of different names for it. The third category within these books is stretching out feed windows. These 2, this is Ezzo's Baby Wise and Giordano and Aberdeen's 12 hours sleep by 12 weeks, suggests stretching out feed windows until you get to a point where the baby's sleeping through the night. It talks about introducing a focal feed or a dream feed early in the night, like at 10 o'clock, and then no more feeds until morning. This list is also exclusive of interventions that are effective but not included in these particular books, like fading or positive bedtime routines. Here on the right is a summary of what the books recommend. So we can see that up here at 1 to 2 weeks, Ezzo's Baby Wise says start stretching a feed window to 4 hours. You can wait 15 minutes, pick the baby up, but put the baby back down until the feed. That's if the baby wakes up in less than the 4 hours you basically coach them them back to sleep at 1 or 2 weeks of age. At 6 weeks, Weissbluth's Healthy Baby Happy Sleep Habits, which is pretty much one of the, I would say, the top-selling book, suggests that you can do 45 minutes of extinction. This is extinction with a cap at 6 weeks. Taking Care of Babies says that you can start stretching feeds to 6 hours at night. And then by 8 weeks, Weissbluth suggests that we can do pure extinction with no maximum of crying at 8 weeks. That you can, the 12 hours sleep says you can start stretching feeds and letting babies cry for 5 minutes. Moms on Call says 15 minutes. Precious Little Sleep, also a big seller, suggests time check-ins 10 to 20 minutes. By 3 to 4 months, most books are saying to start full-on sleep training. Moms on Call says pure extinction. Lots of people say use graduated extinction. Taking Care of Babies uses something called reverse fading, or there's another term for it. But basically, you start with the least action and work up to a feed. The feed would be the last strategy. And then a few finally say at 5 months, start with graduated extinction or check-ins. There we go. So I compared this work to existing studies. So I looked at studies considered empirical evidence for this advice, and I gathered these from systematic reviews using a Sackett or Chambliss criteria to put evidence in a hierarchical evaluation format. These reviews are considered industry standard and have been translated into recommendations, practice recommendations for pediatricians and other professionals. There's one particular paper that's considered by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine to be the evaluation of research supporting extinction. I gleaned studies from those papers, but those were written in 2006, so I also searched for systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were more recent, so I could be sure to include as much of the most up-to-date research as I could. A total of 61 studies were included for evaluation. So here's here's a summary of the samples for these studies on what research has been conducted on the various intervention categories. So advice says to start early. Weissbluth says the younger the child, the more successful parents will be, and therefore he recommends starting incredibly early as 8 weeks. I think for unmodified extinction, and we can see that there is literally virtually no research. I'll tell you, these two studies where there is a line here, Carpenter and Seymour et al., both of these studies just said children under 60 months. We have no idea if there were even any infants in that sample. There was no sample mean given. We really don't even know if there were infants in the sample at all. But you can see that there are no studies supporting pure or unmodified extinction in babies under 6 months. Modified extinction, there are a few more that have babies under 6 months, but let's take a peek at those. A couple of them, you'll see, included younger infants, but only as part of a much larger sample. So this was infants 0 to 36 months. This one's 4 to 52 months. This one looks like 3 months to 48, sorry. So infants were only included as part of a much larger sample, and the results are usually not parsed out by age, so we don't really know how those younger infants fared in that study. Only 7 studies have used actual graduated extinction and have included any infants under 6 months. Of these, 6 of them used infants only as part of a much larger sample, and 2 of those were conducted in an inpatient setting. So this is where mothers were hospitalized with babies with sleep problems. They were given a lot of instrumental support, a lot of emotional support, and in a couple of instances, nurses did the sleep training. Prevention research is research with very young babies in the hopes of preventing sleep problems from even happening in the first place. There is a body of research attempting to do this by using babies as young as like 3 weeks old to see if they could get good habits started early. Across these studies, practical results were often small or non-existent. And here's the key. Intervention did not appear to impact sleep, but parents' perception of a sleep problem. So often, if they measured the baby's sleep versus parent report, the parent said the sleep improved dramatically, but actigraphy showed there was no difference in the baby's sleep. Often prevention protocols did not use extinction per se, but usually was a whole package of strategies. And one part of that package might have said, gave parents information on appropriate responses to night waking, but we have no idea what that actually was. Or it told parents to wait a short time. It wasn't specific, so it's hard to tell what advice in this package parents were actually getting. The other thing is that studies on very young babies fail to assess for the presence of feeding problems, which is often a major culprit in sleep problems in the newborn and early infancy period. The question of whether starting earlier is easier has never been empirically investigated. Parents get told this a lot. It'll be easier if you start early. It'll be so much harder later. Never been studied. We have no data on that at all. So advice says extinction is quick, producing rapid resolution of waking and crying within 3 to 5 nights. If we look at what the timeline was in research, in some of these cases, and these are some of these seminal studies, one took 29 days, pure extinction took 14 days. France and Blampy, this is another seminal study. Some subjects were still crying 50 minutes or more on day 16. So this is not 3 to 5 nights. 3 to 5 nights does happen in a subset of children, but for many, many, many babies, even in research studies, this is not happening. Reichert and Johnson, again, another study that gets cited constantly. It says many professionals have suggested that this problem will abate in 3 to 4 days when parents let the child cry it out. However, the present study indicates that it takes 3 weeks or more before the child's nocturnal awakening and crying are reduced to less than 4 per week. This is not the instant and stable all-night sleep that parents are often promised in the sleep books. Extinction is effective. You'll see these books are saying it's 100% effective, 97% effective, 98% effective. Across research, extinction failed to work for between 25 and 50% of samples in just about every single study. There has been no research on non-responders. So is there a subset of babies for whom consistently extinction doesn't work? We don't know. In practical terms, when you really look at outcomes of studies, practical differences are often small. In some studies, intervention groups only slept 20 minutes more and had a half less waking than the control group. I think if you told parents that they might get 20 minutes more sleep, they would suggest that crying it out's not really worth it. It's important to ask what constitutes effective. This differs by study. Sometimes the only part that was effective was the longest bout of sleep was a little longer, but the baby woke just as much. It took a little less time for the baby to fall asleep. Maybe there were fewer minutes awake, or just parental perception of sleep got better. There so far is no evidence that extinction improves the number of night wakings. Usually it just extends certain aspects of sleep. Some suggest that night wakings are parents' primary concern. And so far the evidence of extinction on that is inconclusive. Another important question is what actually improves. Some studies measured just apparent perception of the problem. Is there still a problem? Some studies measured parental self-efficacy. One study measured perceived control of the child or the child's likability. Effective is different based on the study that you happen to look at. There we go. So parents' experiences and perceptions. In real-world investigations, parents reported lower levels of success using extinction. Lutzenheiser et al. Suggested that most parents were starting extinction at about 4 months, and they theorized that it was because they were starting too early. It's really important to consider the transportability of an extinction method into real-world contexts, because in the vast majority of studies on extinction, the intervention was deployed within a context that we would consider a coaching context. Lots of professional evaluation, often tailoring of a plan to that individual family, lots of follow-up. Parents at home with a book get none of that. And that could be why they're not experiencing the same level of success, is because they simply don't have the kind of support that research subjects do. I did a large-scale parent survey, and across all children, 850 families in that survey, 36% rated extinction is not working at all. I believe that was a 7 on a 7-point scale, that it didn't work at all. 28% said there was significantly more crying than the books told them to expect. 33% reported starting over 2 to 3 times, and 19% started over 5 times. So in the real world context, parents, it is not a quick, easy, solidly effective method. Let me also just say, it's also really well understood that parents just don't like doing extinction, which could also be another explanation for why it's not as uniformly effective. Here's the big one, no negative side effects. Now, I want to say, it's not that crying it out always has negative side effects, but to say that there are never any side effects is also really a flawed idea. First of all, there's really limited study of side effects. Only 17 studies have ever measured any negative side effects. There's an over-reliance on parent report of sleep and behavior, and an underuse of objective assessment. So basically, the parents are asked, do you think there were any negative side effects? We can absolutely suggest that there would be social desirability bias. Also, a parent who is now sleeping better for whatever reason is automatically going to see things in a rosier color just because they're a little bit more rested. So we really need some objective assessment of outcomes. It's often anecdotal. The researcher will just say no negative side effects were observed, but doesn't operationalize how they assessed that at all. Here's to me a pivotal point. The amount of crying in these studies where they look at negative side effects is rarely noted. So how much crying is without effect? Karen France, 1992, has the study that gets cited the most about negative side effects for the infants. And she did note how much crying these infants experience. Now, I should say that in this study, there were only about, I believe it was like 12 subjects. So it's a very small study. But she did tally up how much crying existed. You'll see there were 3 groups: unmodified extinction, minimal check, and parental presence. So look at the ranges. In unmodified extinction, those, I think, 3 or 4 subjects, and this is over 3 weeks. So these are total crying across 21 days or so, went from 385 to 785. In minimal check, 375 to 900, parental presence 130 to 440. Now, because research looks at averages, they took an average of essentially the child who cried 130 minutes and the child who cried 900 minutes and said there were no negative side effects. What we should have done is looked at these children who cried the most and said, were there effects for those specific children? Because we might find that 200 total minutes of crying was fine, but 600 minutes was not. We absolutely do not have this information on how much crying is without effect. We've so relied on averages that the books are now saying there is no evidence that any amount of crying has any cost whatsoever at any age. It should also be mentioned that this study was on babies like 6 to 18 months, and only a couple of them were 6 months. In fact, I believe that the one that cried the most was 6 months. So we also don't know if there's an interaction by amount of crying and age. I would say amount of crying, age, and temperament. No work has ever been done on that topic at all. There's also an over-reliance on the Flint Infant Security Scale as a measure of lack of side effect. The Flint Infant Security Scale was written in 1974 at a time when there was early attempts to get at a measure of attachment. It's often misconstrued as a measure of attachment, but this is a parent report scale that has items on it that are much more related to potentially infant temperament than anything having to do with attachment. Items like infant enjoys rough play, accepts new foods readily, will sit patiently waiting for food to be served, will allow a stranger to change the diaper. These are not measures of attachment. This is something completely different. And yet the Flint Infant Security Scale is still used to this day to assess some kind of outcome of extinction. It's a terrible measure and not one we should be relying on. Any other assessments of attachment often they never took a baseline measure. So they do the intervention, and then at follow-up later they do, one study did the strange situation, other studies have used other measures and said, oh, there were no differences between the groups, but we don't know, again, without a baseline, we don't know if there were changes in attachment. There's also one other pivotal study that said there was no effect on attachment, but they used something called the disinhibited attachment interview, which is only a 5-question scale measuring something called disinhibited attachment, which they saw in Romanian orphans who would indiscriminately run to strangers and be willing to go home with them. This is not the appropriate measure of attachment to assess, and yet when people cite this study, they just say, see, there were no impacts on attachment, but this is the type of attachment that was measured. So what we tell parents matters. When we tell parents that extinction is absolutely effective, there is no negative side effects, it's super quick, it's super effective, we may be really setting parents up for failure when they don't experience that level of success. Plus, most of the books will say if this doesn't work, you're doing it wrong. And that's a real problem from my perspective. I talk to parents every single day who are sure that they are screwing sleep up just because they couldn't hang in there with their child's crying. And I think that's doing a real disservice to parents. An infant mental health perspective is desperately needed in sleep research. It so far has been completely relegated to the medical and pediatric community, and we really need more voices from a relational, dyadic co-regulation perspective on sleep. Research really needs to ask new questions besides, does extinction work? We need to start saying, who does it work for? Who does it not work for? Are there contexts which a certain amount of crying would be really contraindicated? And honestly, is behaviorism even an appropriate paradigm to apply to infants anymore? I don't believe we use it in any other aspect of child rearing except for sleep. And also from my work, temperament really needs to be considered in studies and evaluation of effectiveness. There's a small body of research that suggests that children with what they call a difficult temperament did not respond as well or as effectively to extinction, but no one so far has pursued that question. Part of my parent survey was looking at temperament, and interestingly, across all temperament categories, people had problems with extinction. But when you looked at subgroups of parents with babies who were more intense and more sensitive, they had significantly higher levels of difficulty with sleep training. We really need to look at how temperament interacts with capacities for sleep. So are there differential susceptibilities to crying-based sleep training interventions where we might want to propose some alternatives? Parents need alternatives. That's just a plain fact. We need to push back against the primacy of extinction as if it's the only option. It's not. There are alternatives that are also research-based. They're just not getting the interest from researchers. So please contact me with any questions. I'm happy to talk about this anytime.